Hi, I'm Amit Bouri with the Global Impact Investing Network, and we're here in San Francisco at the GIIN's West Coast Impact Forum, and I'm pleased to be in conversation with John Goldstein of Goldman Sachs. Good to see you. Welcome.
Good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here, and I'm especially excited to have this conversation with you because you were at the inception of all this, and we first got to work together in helping to create the strategy of building a market, which predated the GIIN and the term impact investing, and here we are, 15 years and change later. And one of the things I'd love to just take a moment to discuss is some of your reflections on where the market has come to over these past 15 years. Any big surprises, any disappointments from your perspective, and then we'll talk about where we go from here.
Yeah. No, it is pretty remarkable to reflect on it, and I think my own journey is a sort of a microcosm of how this has evolved. From when Imprint Capital started in 2007, working with large foundations, family offices, to those moments of noticing the client base was changing.
Yeah.
It wasn't just those foundations and families, it was insurance companies.
Right.
It was pension funds, it was financial institutions. And then when Goldman Sachs said that they had this funny idea, but instead of becoming a client, what if they were to buy us in 2015? It was a sign of this thing that had been on the fringe, and then maybe a niche was starting to emerge much more into the mainstream. And then as things have grown and evolved, just seeing who participates, how they participate, and whether it's the capital provider or the investor, right? You have everything ranging from small boutiques to the biggest financial institutions in the world. Mm-hmm. You have things ranging from dedicated foundations to sovereign wealth funds and insurance companies, and the diversity of market participants, both in who's deploying capital and how it's being deployed, has, I think, surpassed, honestly, any of our expectations back when we were gathering and thinking about what this industry could become.
No, I think it's incredibly energizing, and what I'm reckoning with a lot right now, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this, is what you think of impact investing in this moment that we're in.
Yeah.
So we're seeing a lot of geopolitical uncertainty. We've had a year of unprecedented elections and change elections all over the world. A lot of people are trying to make sense of what's the new normal, and when do we know when we're in the new normal. What do you think about the role of impact investing in this moment?
Yeah, I think there are parts about impact investing that are just like investing, right? Which is you have to take stock of what have you learned. When you look back, the rearview mirror is a useful place from which to draw lessons, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what to do, right? And then as you take stock of the environment, do the work. Analyze opportunity, analyze risk, and use that as the basis to craft your course. And so that, in a lot of ways, what impact investors need to do now is no different than what regular way investors do, number one. Number two, as you navigate that in an environment of uncertainty, part of it is finding areas where you can have greater certainty that enables you to act, right? Investors, sitting paralyzed is not always a productive way to steward capital.
Right.
Same thing with impact. It's not always a great way to steward impact. And so how do you analyze environments and see there's still underlying secular growth themes in the real economy, some of which are accelerating even faster, number one. Number two, there are businesses, entrepreneurs that are solving problems, that are saving their customers money, providing more value for fewer dollars, that have genuine solutions that are better mousetraps, usually metaphorically, less literally. I think three, you find ways to build out these gaps in these value chains, where gaps often equal a chance to make money, to generate return, and to have an impact. And finally, you analyze capital flows. Right? What are areas that are potentially oversupplied, which mean there's less impact to be had and frankly less money to be made, and where are there areas that are undersupplied? And that is a basic bedrock analysis of where do you have enough comfort and enough of margin of safety to continue to proceed while realizing there are a lot of uncertainties in the world, but against that backdrop to continue to find meaningful ways to allocate capital.
Yeah. And I just love it, on the personal note, obviously you get to serve clients all over the world doing all kinds of things, but not taking the firm's perspective but your own, what are some of the themes or sectors that excite you most? Just personally you feel passionate about some of these areas? Yeah,
I think, the things where I tend to be passionate about is where I see that people have really come up with better business models, tools, technologies that can transform economic value into more economic value. I think one of the phrases I use a lot is return generating capital is arguably the most renewable resource on the planet, right? But that also the way it does that is by solving a social environmental problem where the gap and the challenge is the addressable
Yeah.
market. And I think back to those 4 principles earlier, where do you have a growth theme, where do you have a value proposition that's resilient across macro environments, geopolitics, et cetera, where do you want to be in the value chain, and how are you on the right side of the supply-demand equation for capital? I think a couple of things stand out in a really interesting way. I think for number one, efficiency. Doing more with less.
Right.
What I like to say is, as you think about value propositions that are resilient across economic environments, saving your customers money it never goes out of style.
Yeah, and especially right now in this budget consciousness that we're seeing all across the market.
For sure, there was a period of time, I think, when there was, you could call it enthusiasm, you could call it aspiration, potentially even naivete, that there'd be a tremendous willingness for consumers and businesses to pay a substantial green premium, right? And then as people became more focused on cost of living issues, as inflation rose, as interest rates rose, I think that quickly became a much more challenged proposition. So, are you costing more? Or are you doing more with less, right? And I think similarly we see, how can we have, private sector innovation that solves social and environmental problems, these better mousetraps, right? This is where, technology can play a phenomenal role, right? For example, if you think about investing in accessible, affordable, impactful health or financial services or education, you have what people often call the iron triangle, right? How do you expand access, improve outcomes, and lower cost? That's stretching a bed sheet across an awful lot of bed space, right? And so what can solve for that generally is one of 2 things in terms of business model innovation. Number one, technology. If you can use technology to add efficacy, take out cost, and improve scale and reach, that helps address that. And number 2, often finding revenue streams that can make a difference. So for example, in a very low unemployment world, there's tremendous demand for upskilled workers in trades that are growing, right? And ultimately, you have people who want to retrain for the new economy, and you have employers that will pay for that. So if you can use technology to drive better training at lower cost, and you have someone else to be the revenue stream, this allows you to have this business model innovation to tackle a large issue, which is worker retraining in economically impactful ways. So that's where I get excited, right? When people have found a way to make the economics work, right? Both at a unit, particularly at a unit basis. This sort of impact economics question is one that I'm kind of endlessly fascinated with.
Well, and I think those speak to the moment we're in right now, just around what are the priorities and what do we need to do for the workforce, and also just to meet the intense budgetary pressure households and corporates and governments are experiencing right now.
Everyone has to find ways to do more with less. And once again, this is where innovation can make a real difference.
Now, before we close, I want to look ahead. If you think about the future of impact investing, we first met, I think it was actually 16 years ago. Thinking about where this market needs to go, and if we look ahead, let's say 10, 15 years from now, where do you think impact investing is going, or where would you like it to go?
I think we've seen an ebb and a flow, and this is true with impact and a lot of the cousinly adjacent areas around sustainability and other topics. I think there was a period of time of tremendous growth, tremendous excitement, where that excitement in some ways got a little more oriented to the label and the name than what was under the hood, right? And I think what we saw was, well-intentioned attempts to serve that market with growth, but sometimes it got a little unanchored from this very pragmatic, rigorous work that it takes to do any type of investing well. And I think this is a time to kind of get back to basics, right? It's not about what can you call a product. It's not about a label. It's not about marketing something. At the root of all of this needs to be a thesis. A thesis, a business model, an underlying economic case. And I think for me, the future is kind of getting back to that as a central point that makes this relevant to a diverse set of actors. I see some pools of capital out in the world that just look into the future and they want to know where's their growth, right? I was talking to a sovereign wealth fund the other, about 6 months ago, and they wanted to come and have a talk about the biggest things shaping the global economy. And they said it is geopolitics, AI, and climate transition, right? And those are all interrelated. They all push and pull on each other. We ended up publishing a paper on this. And I think kind of the normalization of a lot of this. It's not a niche off to the corner. These are real things in the real economy that are risks and opportunities across a much more diverse set of investors and a much more diverse set of market participants. And I think getting that normalization, right? I think in realizing, let's get to the underlying fundamentals of these markets and these opportunities. I think that allows pools of capital, both large and small, to find their right space as this grows and as this evolves.
Well, I think that's a great point to land on. And I really like this idea of getting back to basics and the fundamentals. Because when we first talked about impact investing, it was about solving problems, right? Meeting unmet needs. And I think this is a time in the world when we have a lot of unmet needs, but also a lot of tools, a lot of resources, a lot more experience in the market. And so I think that focus on how do we improve people's lives, how do we actually heal the planet and make sure we're addressing the needs of our natural systems and the climate, I think is such a great thing to focus on. This current moment of volatility, there's a lot of fundamental things impact investing can deliver.
No, and look, at the end of the day, what do markets look for? What do entrepreneurs look for? They look for large addressable markets where innovation can win.
Yeah.
Right. And at the end of the day, I think there is this normalization of parts of this, right? It's not this completely alien sport, right? It is solving problems. Like that ultimately is what capital is for. It's for meeting needs in the marketplace, better than other people, right? And I think that's back to basics, I think, is what I'm so excited about, and being centered and seeing all the great ideas, and even just being here, hearing all the great work people are doing, and excited to see that grow into the future.
Well, great. Well, John, thank you so much for this time, and thank you for joining us here at the West Coast Impact Forum.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks.
Thanks, Amit.